Tonight on The Nation Speaks, YouTube's new policy uncovering election disputes. What does it mean? And what impact did $350 million donated by Mark Zuckerberg and his wife have on the election? Good evening and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. Yesterday, YouTube announced it will start removing any piece of content that misleads people by alleging that widespread fraud or errors changed the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, and that it will ramp up censorship in the weeks to come. The announcement comes even as allegations of widespread fraud are being considered by the courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court. Texas and now 6 more states have lawsuits before the Supreme Court arguing that last-minute changes to election laws in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin were A, unconstitutional, and B, led to significant voting irregularities. So much so that it puts the very outcome of the 2020 election in doubt. Obviously, discussion of those irregularities will form the substance of their case, but YouTube says it will censor those discussions. I'm joined tonight by the perfect person to give us some insight into YouTube's move, investigative journalist Allum Bokhari. He's the author of Deleted, Big Tech's Battle to Erase the Trump Movement and Steal the Election. Allum, welcome.
Cindy, good to be on.
So this seems to be a continuation of everything you talked about in your book. Are you surprised by YouTube's announcement, which to me seems a little brazen?
I can't say I am surprised because the story that my book describes is a 4-year process that Silicon Valley embarked on immediately after the 2016 election to do everything in its power to prevent Donald Trump from winning re-election. And those aren't my words. Those are the words of sources inside Facebook and Google and other tech companies who spoke to me for the book. And what we're seeing after the election is just an escalation of that. This idea that you can't talk about the possibility of voter fraud or widespread irregularities in what is turning out to be the most disputed presidential election in living memory. We have 18 states now filing lawsuits against 4 of the swing states, alleging that they conducted the election unconstitutionally and improperly. And that's going to the Supreme Court. But the Silicon Valley tech giants, as far as they're concerned, the election is over. Their guy won. And in fact, their guy, Biden, is now appointing tech executives already to his transition team. So they know that Biden's going to reward them. But the election is not over. The court cases are ongoing. They're escalating, in fact. So we're going to be in a situation where the American public won't know if they're allowed to discuss the most important political issue in the country on the country's leading tech platforms.
Right, exactly. So from what you've been observing and talking to people, what's been happening over the last 4 years since the 2016 election and Silicon Valley, from all reports, woke up to a big surprise that Donald Trump, in fact, won?
Well, multiple things exist today that didn't exist in 2016. For example, social media's distinction between authoritative and non-authoritative sources, where they promote one type of source and downrank or shadow ban the other, or adjust their secret quality score that every website has and every account on social media has to make sure fewer and fewer users see the content. They didn't have that in 2016. They also didn't have a notion of fake news. They didn't have an organized effort against so-called hate speech or so-called conspiracy theories or so-called disinformation. All of these initiatives against these things sprang up in Silicon Valley after 2016. And according to my Facebook source, the impetus was Donald Trump's election. The people who led those efforts were the most anti-Trump people at the companies, and those same people went on to staff those initiatives.
So what techniques do they use exactly under the hood?
Well, let's talk about one example, which I mentioned in the book, and which was actually recently confirmed by a New York Times report, which is the quality ranking. So the way what you got to understand, like how do things appear at the top of Google results, or the top of your Facebook feed, or the top of your Twitter feed, and what determines what goes on like the billionth page when no one will ever find it? It's a numerical value that the algorithms of all of these platforms use to determine the so-called quality of a link, if it matches what a user is searching for or interested in. Only now, today, what determines that score is going to be, well, does the platform consider the source to be authoritative, or is it a site known for so-called conspiracy theories or so-called hate? So the things that lower your score today are increasingly things that are determined by political criteria, by what the tech companies value or don't value in a political sense. Whereas in the past, the things that would lower your score would be things like, viruses and malware and spam. That would ensure you don't appear at the top of Google search results, which is quite reasonable. But now it's, are you the tech company's favorite news source, or are you one of their disfavored news sources? So it's becoming actually very similar to the Chinese social credit system, where people and businesses are penalized if they don't adhere to the values of the ruling elite. We have a ruling elite now, and Silicon Valley is part of it. And if you don't adhere to their values, then you're going to be erased and buried in these important rankings.
So it seems that both the Democrats and the Republicans are talking somewhat about reining in the tech companies, and there's antitrust suits and that sort of thing. But it seems that they're coming at it from some slightly different angles. What's your take on that?
I would say precisely the opposite angles, in fact. So we recently, in the past few days, had a case filed by the New York Attorney General against Facebook, alleging competition concerns. And one of the points made in that lawsuit is that Facebook, according to the New York Attorney General, obviously a Democrat, is defrauding advertisers or not doing right by their advertisers because they're allowing ads to appear next to so-called misinformation and so-called objectionable content. So the implied message of that lawsuit is that Facebook needs to censor its platform even more. And I think that's going to be the implied message behind a lot of the Biden administration's actions on big tech, if it takes any. The unspoken promise to the tech companies will be, if you toe the line on censorship, if you continue censoring conservative and independent media, then we're going to ease up on all these enforcement actions. Whereas I think Republicans, the few Republicans who take the issue seriously and want to do something about it, they want the opposite. They want less censorship. That's the point of Donald Trump's threats around Section 230. This idea that if companies, pick and choose what their users see and censor content on their users' behalf, they should lose some of their legal privileges. So completely opposite directions that both parties are coming at this issue from.
Do you think, it seems that a lot of people are going to abandon YouTube, they're going to places like, Rumble, they're using Parler instead of Twitter. So it seems sort of the net effect of that is creating two parallel social media worlds. Do you think that's been the intention, or there'll be an attempt to co-opt those other worlds, or what do you think is the outcome here?
Well, it's both a positive and a negative. So, as you said, all of these alternative platforms that offer free speech, such as Gab.com, the original free speech social network, Rumble, the YouTube alternative, Parler, another alternative to Twitter and Facebook, they've all enjoyed explosive growth since the election. This is good and bad in certain senses. It's good in the sense that conservatives will have a place to organize where they won't be censored, where they can talk to each other, where they can build campaigns, where they can do fundraising. That's something that's been denied to them on the mainstream platform. So that's very, very good for conservatives. On the other hand, the undecided voters, the voters on the fence, the Democrats, are unlikely to follow them. They'll probably stay on the mainstream platforms. That allows the mainstream tech companies to monopolize their attention. So that is a problem there. But it's probably an unavoidable problem because conservatives haven't been given any other option. They have to go to the alternatives. The mainstream tech platforms are censoring them en masse. So they obviously are going to the alternatives. But I think something that these companies should watch out for, Parler and Rumble, is that the next thing that I predict is going to happen is going to be the same thing that happened to Gab, which is that there'll be pressure on Google and Apple, who control 99% of the world's smartphone operating systems, to kick them off the app stores, and thus, deny access to smartphone users, make it extremely difficult to get their apps on your smartphone. I think that'll be the next step for the left. They already did that to Gab. I think they'll do it to Parler and Rumble as well.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that outcome there. So what do you think the solutions are at this point? I know your book talks about some of them. Where do you think we can go?
Well, the creation of alternative tech platforms certainly is part of the solution, and it's a very good thing that platforms like Gab and Parler and Rumble are doing well and adding more competition to the marketplace, genuine competition, where these platforms are offering different terms of service, which is extremely important. But I don't think anything changes fundamentally. You don't resolve this problem unless there's massive change to give users actual legal rights in relation to these platforms, where they're actually able to take them to court if they're wrongfully have their accounts terminated or their presence wiped off the internet. And there has to be Section 230 reform as well. But the only way that happens is if the Republican Party gets serious about it. So I think it'll really come down to ordinary Republican voters mobilizing on this issue and really getting active in the Republican primaries to make sure that the old guard of the Republican Party, who think that if you interfere with these immensely privileged, immensely powerful tech companies, you're somehow interfering in the free market. That has to be thrown out the window. And if Republican voters do that, then there might be some real change coming down the line.
So we talked earlier about, there's a lot of credible allegations of voter fraud that are being looked at in the Supreme Court now. And then we have the situation that you're describing with the tech companies. What do you think Americans should be worried about most if they want to protect democracy and free speech in the country?
Well, it's hard to say. There's been such a collapse in quite rightly, I think, a collapse in trust of all mainstream elite institutions, from the mainstream corporate media to the voting system, and now the tech giants as well. I will maintain that the tech giants are the most dangerous threat, not just to American democracy, but to democracy all around the world. These platforms like Facebook and Google don't just dominate the American market, they dominate the Australian market, the British market, Europe, everywhere you look. They have their thumbs on the scales of democracy. And as we're seeing now, if you're concerned about more old-fashioned types of voter fraud, ballot harvesting, mail-in ballot fraud, things like that, the tech companies will get in your way and say, well, you can't talk about that if you're alleging that the candidate we like didn't win. So I think the tech companies are the primary threat to freedom and democracy, as I said, not just in America, but around the world now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Allum. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up after the break, how did $350 million in grant money from the Zuckerbergs impact voters? But first, here's America Q&A.
Absolutely. Somebody's always out there going through the news feed.
I do believe that. We had posted something in regards to having COVID, and so they censored it immediately and took it down from our post on Facebook.
Of course, all the time. Yeah, we saw the Mark Zuckerberg when he was in front of that court, not be able to answer questions about it. Like that alone should tell you enough.
I don't have Facebook or any kind of social media because I think it is corrupting the minds of our youth and our people.
Yes, Facebook is fairly open about censorship. They've released different warnings about stuff that they change, stuff that they're okay with, but they're also a private business, so it's really up to the business itself.
I repeated words of Don Lemon, and I called it back towards him, and then they suspended my account unless I deleted it, but those were his words. I just put him in the sentence.
I wouldn't say they try to ban them, but I would definitely say that they're biased on certain views.
I have seen that they put comments disputing comments of the President Trump.
Oh, absolutely. From when you're scrolling, you're always seeing blocked out.
No, I don't.
No, I don't, because I consider myself more libertarian, and I look from both sides on my political news from both networks and both big political speakers and stuff like that.
I think that's without a doubt that they're censoring everyone that's on those platforms, so that's why we've seen such a huge rise in alternate ones like Parler.
Welcome back. During the 2020 election, a nonprofit called the Center for Tech and Civic Life donated $350 million to help people vote and improve the election process. There's been some controversy over the type of help that was provided. Joining us tonight to explain that controversy is Scott Walter. He's a president of Capital Research Center in DC. It's a think tank focused on studying the nonprofit world. Scott, welcome.
Great to be here.
So can we start by you explaining to us what the connection is between the Zuckerbergs and the nonprofit that I mentioned that goes by CTCL?
Yes, the Center for Tech and Civic Life, or CTCL, received $350 million from Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan. As best we understand, it came straight from their own checking account and not from any other entity that they are part of.
And what is it that CTCL does?
Well, they claim that they help to educate the electorate and make elections run better and whatnot. But what you should know is that their leadership all came from a previous group called the New Organizing Institute, which was made no bones about being a Democratic Party institution designed to help get out the vote and otherwise affect elections in the Democrats' favor.
So what do they actually do on the ground with that $350 million?
This, last year and the previous few years, their budget was, if they were lucky, their budget was $1 million. Now that they have the $350 million, this year they've done something extraordinary. They re-granted that money to local election offices around the country. That is to say, actual government offices running elections for counties or cities or townships and the rest.
And so what are they doing with that money?
Well, they would like you to think that all they cared about was things like PPE, personal protective equipment and whatnot, for the election officials and the people voting. But if you actually go to their website and see what their template for a local election officials applying for money, you'd see they were concerned about things like nonpartisan voter education and the number of drop boxes and early voting days and the rest.
So I'd like to ask about what that nonpartisan voter education looked like. But first, was this money distributed evenly across the states and across counties, or how did they decide who would get it?
Well, they say that anybody who applied who is actually a local election office would get a grant. Now, their minimum, thank you for playing the game amount was like $5,000, which of course isn't really very much money for an election office most anywhere. But if you were a big city like Philadelphia or Atlanta, or you would get millions of dollars. So all told, there were over 2,000 offices that got money, but lots of those were very small, and as far as we can determine, got little money. Now, that's the fact we can't determine better is the fault of CTCL. Legally speaking, when they file their next IRS tax forms, they'll have to disclose anybody they gave $5,000 or more to, any government office. But they don't have to do that for a year, and they're refusing to do that. The Associated Press has asked, the National Public Radio has asked, the New Yorker magazine has asked. They're not telling anybody anything about where the money came from or where it went. The only reason we know about the Zuckerbergs' money is because they themselves disclosed that.
But you do know something from some reports. You can tell us how you know about areas that got more money and how they compared to areas that got less. What are some highlights from that information?
Sure. We at Capital Research Center are starting to do state-by-state investigations. Again, we can't be positive we know about all the grants in a given state, but here's what we were able to do is we went to see local news reports. Sometimes the local election offices made a report. And then the only thing that the CTCL folks did do is they put online what's labeled a preliminary list of grantees. It doesn't give you the dollar amounts. It only tells you, say, the counties that got grants. So our first report came out a few days ago. It was for the state of Georgia. And the numbers there are just amazing. I won't, there's lots more. If you go to capitalresearch.org, you can find a lot more numbers, but let me just give you 2 or 3 highlights that show you how nonpartisan, quote unquote, they were. In Georgia, if you're a county that Biden won, you were 2.5 times more likely to get a grant from CTCL than you were if you were a Trump county, a county that voted for Trump. But even more than that, if you look at the per capita grant monies. So as far as we know, there was only one county in the whole state that went for Trump and received more than $1 per capita in funding. But for the big Democrat-leaning counties like Fulton County of Atlanta, Georgia, they got in the neighborhood of $7 to $10 or more for every man, woman, and child in that county. And the results, similarly, are huge. Let's take the whole state of Georgia. They funded, CTCL funded 44 of the 159 counties, so a little less than a third of the counties. And if you look at all of those counties in total that got any funding at all, the Republican presidential vote this year was about 207,000 more than it was in 2016, the last presidential election. But the Democrat vote went up in those same counties by 530,000. So that means 3.5 times more more votes for Democrats than Republicans in the counties they funded.
So your concern is that money was being spent somehow to increase the vote for Democrats, that that's directly what the money was used for. What do you think the mechanisms were for that?
Well, by the way, let me correct my math. I apologize. There is a 3.5 times number. That was one of the 2.5 times numbers, obviously, about 200 to over 500,000 votes. The thing to understand about this, the left has been doing this kind of thing using 501c3 nonprofits for years, and it's not, it's not incredibly obvious. They're not hanging up big signs that say "Vote Democratic." What they're doing instead is very quietly and carefully targeting locations and demographics in a given state where they know if they can boost the turnout for that location or demographic group, most of the votes will be going in the Democratic column. So they use very sophisticated techniques of how they design the materials that you get, and how especially how they target the populations that are going to get them. And it's not at all obvious the way you might think, but nonetheless, it's highly effective, as you can tell by that 2.5 times differential in the counties that got funded in Georgia.
And is it unusual that they would be giving grants to actual government offices instead of some other voter, get out the vote group?
Absolutely. Left-wing groups like CTCL will typically they're spending their own money themselves to do things like send people mailers that look like they're official government mailers urging you to vote or urging you to ask for an absentee ballot. But in this year, in addition to being supercharged with the $350 million, which is easily triple what the left would typically spend on this using 501c3 money, the other great advance this year was funding directly into local government election offices. That is just amazing that they would do that. There are a few states where that's illegal. Most states have never bothered to make it illegal, but they've never had anybody try to do it. We'll see if after this election mess this year, I would bet and I would hope that a lot of states would say, we're not going to allow private funding of government election offices.
So I was going to ask you if there's anything illegal in these activities. Is there anything else that could be illegal? I guess this isn't in some of the states you're operating in, or most of them.
Well, the direct funding of election offices is only illegal in a relatively small number of states. there are it is conceivable, it's never really been tested much in the courts, it's conceivable that election laws, federal election laws, would say this was an in-kind donation to a political campaign that never got reported and should have been. So that's one legal possibility. The bigger legal possibility is federal tax law, because C3 groups can't intervene in elections in a partisan fashion under federal election law. But these kinds of murky, like, are they really? They don't print things that have huge letters saying vote Democratic. They just target Democrat-leaning constituencies. So that's not been tested in the courts. It's a murky area of the law at the moment. And what that means is that conservatives who have respect for laws, when they ask their lawyers, well, could we do this? Their lawyers tell them, well, it's risky. It could easily be illegal. And so the conservative side doesn't do it. The left-wing side, on the other hand, when they hear that it's all murky, they're just shameless. And in a typical cycle, they'll spend $100 million a year in toto on this kind of thing.
And so I know Georgia was one of the big spending states, and we've got the runoff election coming up in January. Are they still spending this kind of money in Georgia?
Astoundingly, yes. If you go to the Center for Tech and Civic Life's website, you'll see on the front page a link for how to apply for yet more money for your runoff elections in January. And you can understand that because the stakes are enormous. You know, the U.S. Senate, Republican or Democratic control, is going to hinge on those elections. So they're quite happy to keep doing the sort of work that they did in the November election, which, to everyone's astonishment, flipped the state of Georgia from red state to blue.
So we have to wrap up, but I just want to ask one more question. What you're describing, there's a lot of red flags, seems problematic, but nothing necessarily or obviously illegal. On the other side, there's still a lot of credible allegations of voter fraud. How much of an impact do you think the activities you're describing could have had on the election outcome compared to, say, potential voter fraud?
Well, I can't claim, we investigate the nonprofit world. I'm not an expert on all the voter fraud type things that are swirling around, but I can tell you a good friend of mine is J. Christian Adams. He's one of the top lawyers in the vote fraud world, and he recently wrote that he thinks what CTCL did, which is roughly speaking legal or at least not obviously illegal, was more important in this election than actual, flat out illegal vote fraud.
Very interesting. All right, Scott, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Great to be with you.
And that's all for tonight's show. Thank you so much for watching The Nation Speaks. Join us again tomorrow evening at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And from all of us here, good night.